For centuries, humanity was seen as weak and insignificant. A young species from an unremarkable star system, clinging to survival on the fringe of galactic civilization. Their lifespans were short, their emotions volatile, their politics fractured and loud. To the ancient powers of the galaxy, humans were a curiosity at best, and a footnote at worst. They were ignored by the galaxy, dismissed by those in power, observed only long enough to confirm that they would never matter. When humanity first reached beyond its home system, Council analysts predicted a brief rise followed by inevitable decline. Too impatient, too divided, too dependent on external trade and shared infrastructure. Time, the Council believed, would do what it always had: end them quietly. When human representatives requested greater access to trade routes, the petition stalled. When they protested territorial encroachment, their complaints vanished into bureaucratic archives. When human colonies struggled under increasingly restrictive regulations, the Council assured itself this was merely the natural order correcting itself. Humanity was expected to adapt, or collapse. Then humanity began to disappear. Trade traffic slowed. Communications grew sporadic. Once noisy data channels fell silent. Navigation beacons blinked out across human space, one by one, until entire systems appeared abandoned. Council observers marked the trend as confirmation. Humanity, they concluded, was finished. Files were archived. Borders were redrawn. Projections were closed. The galaxy moved on without ceremony or regret. What the Council never understood was that disappearance did not mean defeat. It meant withdrawal. Humanity had learned a lesson every overlooked species eventually faces: survival does not come from approval. It comes from preparation. When the galaxy turned its attention elsewhere, humanity used the darkness. They dismantled what could be seen and rebuilt where no one looked. Cities moved beneath surfaces. Shipyards vanished into asteroid belts. Research continued far from the reach of Council oversight. Humanity stopped arguing with a galaxy that had already decided their fate. They began planning for life without it. To the Council, silence meant extinction. To humanity, silence meant freedom. While ancient powers debated borders and influence, humanity studied patterns: how empires grew complacent, how authority relied on predictability, how time was weaponized against the young and the patient alike. And humanity learned something the Council never anticipated. Time does not belong to the old. It belongs to those willing to use it. No one realized how dangerous that mistake would be, until humanity returned, and the galaxy discovered that finished was never the same as gone. The Galactic Council tightened its grip without ever admitting it had done so. There were no fleets dispatched to human space, no declarations of hostility. Open force would have implied humanity mattered. Instead, the Council relied on what it had perfected over millennia: control through regulation. Trade was cut first. Shipping lanes that once supplied human colonies were quietly reclassified. Permits expired and were never renewed. Tariffs rose under the justification of market stabilization, while inspections multiplied until human cargo vessels became unprofitable to operate. Medical compounds, advanced components, and precision alloys stopped arriving altogether. The Council called it economic correction. Humanity felt it as strangulation. When human delegates protested, their access diminished. Speaking time in council chambers was reduced. Voting rights were suspended pending compliance reviews. Appeals vanished into committees designed to delay rather than decide. Rights were revoked one clause at a time. Human research institutions were removed from shared data networks. Exploration licenses were withdrawn. Migration rights were restricted, trapping millions in systems stripped of economic viability. Human colonies were reclassified as non-essential regions, quietly excluding them from emergency protections. Isolation was not announced. It was engineered. Humanity was pushed to the margins of galactic infrastructure, away from shared trade, shared knowledge, and shared influence. Neighboring powers expanded into contested regions without consequence. Human protests were logged and archived. Human losses were reduced to statistical adjustments. The Council expected collapse. Their projections were confident. Humans relied too heavily on external supply chains. Their politics were fragmented. Their cultures loud, argumentative, and inefficient. Cut them off long enough, and they would fracture inward, competing for dwindling resources until they destroyed themselves. Some council members spoke openly of inevitability. A regrettable outcome. A necessary lesson. Proof of galactic order. Humanity did not riot. There were no galaxy-wide broadcasts of desperation. No dramatic last stands. Instead, human systems began to change in ways the Council did not bother to monitor closely. Production shifted inward. Colonies once optimized for export were redesigned for self-sufficiency. Black market innovation became sanctioned necessity. Every restriction forced adaptation. Every loss became a problem to solve. Human signals to the wider galaxy began to thin, not through damage, but intent. Navigation beacons went dark. Data traffic narrowed to tightly focused transmissions. Entire systems reduced their external emissions until they blended into background noise. Council observers interpreted the silence as decay. Timelines were shortened. Humanity's projected extinction was moved forward. What the Council never considered was that isolation was not a death sentence. It was freedom. Freed from oversight, freed from imposed standards, freed from expectations, humanity began operating on its own terms. Decisions that once took years were made in months. Projects long dismissed as too risky or unnecessary were pursued without hesitation. The Council waited patiently. They believed time was still on their side. They never noticed when time stopped working against humanity and began working for them. Isolation didn't break humanity. It unified them. At first, the fractures remained. Old rivalries clung to life out of habit. Governments argued reflexively. Corporations guarded interests that no longer had meaning. Colonies still identified themselves by origin rather than purpose. Humanity had always been divided, convinced that disagreement was strength and that someone else would intervene before consequences became fatal. Isolation stripped that illusion away. When the last reliable trade routes collapsed, the truth became unavoidable. No world could survive alone. Medical shortages on one planet meant nothing without manufacturers on another. Energy-rich systems were helpless without food producers. Knowledge scattered across proprietary networks faced extinction unless it was shared freely. Survival demanded cooperation. Emergency summits were convened, not for diplomacy, but logistics. Former enemies sat across from one another without ceremony or posturing. Accusations were dropped, not forgiven, simply rendered irrelevant. Borders blurred as resources flowed where they were needed, not where they were owned. Arguments ended the moment extinction entered the room. The first unified authority was provisional, created to coordinate supply chains and prevent famine. The second integrated planetary defenses and evacuation planning. By the third, no one pretended this was temporary. Every colony voted. For the first time in human history, the decision was unanimous. All planetary defense forces, industrial output, research infrastructure, and off-world assets would answer to a single command. There were no flags raised. No anthems played. No leaders crowned or celebrated. This was not conquest. It was consolidation. The unified human command emerged quietly, born not from ambition but from clarity. Humanity finally accepted a truth the Council never had: survival does not negotiate, and unity is not optional. Colonies that once competed now specialized. Production chains were rebuilt for redundancy instead of efficiency. Research was shared without restriction. Scientists stopped guarding discoveries and began accelerating them. Military doctrines were rewritten from the ground up, focused not on victory, but endurance. Unity changed culture as much as strategy. Human art grew restrained, purposeful. Stories stopped dreaming of acceptance and began teaching resilience. History was rewritten, not to glorify past triumphs, but to catalog mistakes so they would never be repeated. Children grew up knowing the galaxy had decided they were expendable, and knowing they would never allow that decision to be made again. As unity deepened, humanity's external presence faded. Navigation beacons were shut down. Long-range broadcasts ceased. Even passive emissions were reduced until human space became indistinguishable from empty stars. To the Council, humanity had gone silent. To itself, humanity had become whole. Defense doctrine evolved rapidly. Humanity stopped preparing for war and began preparing for abandonment. Every scenario assumed worst-case conditions: total isolation, overwhelming enemy force, loss of entire systems without warning. Victory was no longer the goal. Continuity was. If one world fell, others would endure. If fleets were destroyed, replacements would rise. Humanity redesigned itself so that no single failure, political, military, or cultural, could end them. At the heart of it all was a shared understanding, simple and unspoken. No treaties would save them. No councils would intervene. No ancient powers would come to their aid. If no one else would protect them, humanity would protect itself. By the time the Galactic Council archived humanity as a species in terminal decline, unity was complete. What the galaxy mistook for fragmentation was, in truth, preparation. Humanity was no longer a collection of worlds. It was a single will. And it was just getting started. In silence, humanity evolved. There were no announcements, no demonstrations meant to be seen. Progress unfolded far from trade lanes and observation posts, beneath asteroid belts stripped hollow from within, inside rogue planets drifting between stars, and deep in systems the galaxy had long dismissed as irrelevant. Human engineers began by abandoning familiar assumptions. The engines that once powered human ships had been designed for efficiency, cost, and council compliance. Those designs were scrapped entirely. New drives emerged, systems that no longer pushed against space, but reshaped it. Test vessels did not accelerate. They vanished from one coordinate and appeared at another, distance reduced to a negotiable inconvenience. Travel was no longer a journey. It was a decision. Energy systems followed the same philosophy. Reactors were redesigned not for peak output, but permanence. Layers of redundancy ensured that no single failure could cascade. Where older designs accepted breakdown as inevitable, human doctrine rejected the premise outright. Failure was no longer tolerated. Then came the shields. Galactic defenses relied on dispersion, overload thresholds, and predictable limits refined over millennia. Human shields ignored those principles. They adapted dynamically, reshaping themselves to incoming energy profiles before impact occurred. Attacks were absorbed, redistributed, and nullified without visible stress or flare. Archived Council weapons data was used for testing. The outcome never changed. No penetration. No degradation. No learning curve for the attacker. Fleets were constructed around these advancements, but not as symbols of power. Human ships were dense, angular, and unapologetically utilitarian. Every vessel was built to operate independently for decades. Manufacturing systems were embedded directly into hulls. Ammunition, components, and even replacement structures could be produced mid-mission. There were no ceremonial flagships. There was no center to destroy. Command architecture was distributed by design. Authority shifted dynamically, flowing to where it was needed and dissolving where it was not. No single loss, no admiral, no ship, no system, could cripple the whole. Humanity studied the galaxy while it worked. They analyzed how empires rose, how they overextended, and how they failed. Patterns emerged with unsettling consistency. Power did not collapse from weakness. It collapsed from rigidity, systems unable to adapt when reality diverged from expectation. Human doctrine was built to bend. Weapons research advanced quietly, compartmentalized so deeply that even human worlds knew only fragments. Dead systems became laboratories. Brief gravitational distortions, momentary stellar dimming, and localized anomalies went unnoticed by anyone not already looking elsewhere. Humanity did not pursue destruction. They pursued certainty. Communications evolved as well. Broad-spectrum broadcasts were abandoned. Human signals became narrow, precise, and tightly focused, nearly impossible to intercept without knowing exactly where to look. Humanity did not disappear through stealth alone. They disappeared through discipline. While the galaxy expanded, argued, and postured, humanity refined. While ancient powers debated borders and influence, human fleets drilled in silence, rehearsing scenarios that assumed everything would go wrong. Total isolation. Overwhelming enemy force. No allies. No warning. Survival was the only metric that mattered. By the time subtle anomalies reached the edges of Council awareness, navigation data that refused to stabilize, empty systems behaving incorrectly, gravity that no longer obeyed established models, humanity was ready. The Galactic Council believed it had sidelined a weak species. In truth, it had done something far more dangerous. It had looked away. And while the galaxy wasn't watching, humanity prepared for the day it would be needed again. Then a new enemy appeared. There was no warning carried ahead of it, no declaration, no ritualized first contact, no demand for submission. One cycle, a frontier system, failed to report. The next, an entire sector vanished from the star charts. Trade routes went dark. Relay stations fell silent. Long-range sensors returned only static and impossible readings. The survivors named them the Dominion. Not because that was what they called themselves, but because domination was the only pattern anyone could identify. Worlds fell. Not after prolonged sieges or heroic resistance, but with terrifying speed. Dominion fleets arrived in overwhelming numbers, their formations dense and unforgiving. Planetary shields, some refined over thousands of years, collapsed within minutes. Orbital defenses were neutralized before they could coordinate. Communications were severed first, ensuring no warnings traveled ahead of the invasion. Entire systems were taken before the Council could even convene an emergency session. Species were enslaved. Populations were catalogued with clinical efficiency. Cultures were stripped down to utility. Billions were relocated to industrial worlds or resource hubs, their identities erased and replaced with serial designations. Some species were absorbed into the Dominion's labor machine. Others were scattered so thoroughly that they ceased to exist as coherent civilizations. Resistance proved meaningless. Council fleets engaged wherever they could, confident in doctrines honed across millennia of conflict. They lost, consistently and decisively. Tactics that succeeded once failed immediately after. Countermeasures were anticipated before they were deployed. Every engagement fed the Dominion more data, more certainty. The enemy did not merely fight wars. They optimized them. The Galactic Council responded the way it always had. They argued. Emergency chambers filled with representatives debating terminology while star maps updated behind them in real time, red zones spreading outward like a malignant growth. Committees were formed to determine responsibility. Votes stalled over cost-sharing and jurisdiction. Fleets were promised, then delayed, then quietly reassigned as political calculations shifted. Systems burned while syntax was debated. Some council members fortified their borders and withdrew support entirely, deciding that sacrifice elsewhere might buy them time. Others demanded concessions before committing forces. Unity fractured under pressure, exposing how fragile the Council's authority truly was. Panic finally set in when a founding Council world fell. Not a fringe colony. Not a junior member. A core system. The final transmission was calm, disturbingly so. Cities remained intact. Infrastructure undamaged. There was no sign of planetary devastation. The world had not been destroyed. It had been claimed. The illusion of safety collapsed overnight. Ancient emergency powers were invoked. Defense clauses long treated as ceremonial were activated. Fleets were mobilized at last, too scattered, too constrained by politics, too late. Losses mounted rapidly as Dominion forces pressed inward, their advance accelerating with every victory. Desperation forced the unthinkable. Someone reopened the archived files. Humanity. Status. Finished. Projection. Collapse following isolation. But the data no longer aligned. Old sensor logs were re-examined. Unexplained fleet losses near former human space. Anomalous gravitational readings. Navigation failures without identifiable cause. Patterns emerged, ones that had been dismissed years earlier as statistical noise. A theory took shape. Humanity had not collapsed. They had withdrawn. Reconnaissance probes were dispatched toward what had once been human territory. Most never returned. Those that did sent back fragmented data, distorted readings, masked energy signatures, and unmistakable evidence of vast, organized infrastructure. Human fleets. Not massed at borders. Not postured for conquest. Layered. Deep. Prepared. Defensive networks spanned entire systems, integrated so completely they appeared as singular structures. There were no visible borders, yet nothing crossed without being noticed. Humanity had not vanished. They had been waiting. The Council did not celebrate this discovery. They argued. Some demanded immediate alliance overtures. Others insisted on formal apologies, restitution, and renewed oversight. A few suggested leverage. After all, humanity had once been weak. Surely pressure could still be applied. The irony went unspoken. When the Dominion breached another sector, this one dangerously close to the Council's core, the arguments ended. A single transmission was authorized. Carefully worded. Restrained. Stripped of overt arrogance, though traces remained. The Galactic Council requested assistance. And for the first time in its long history, the galaxy waited for an answer from the species it had written off as finished. From the silence it had imposed. From humanity. The Council expected forgiveness. They prepared their words with care, formal acknowledgments of error, expressions of regret crafted to sound sincere without admitting guilt. Envoys rehearsed speeches about unity, necessity, and shared survival, convinced that desperation would make humanity pliable. They believed need would restore hierarchy. They found resolve. The response did not arrive through sanctioned diplomatic channels. It did not request an audience or recognition. Instead, it appeared simultaneously across Council space, overriding encryption and translation systems as if they were suggestions rather than safeguards. A single transmission. The image showed a human seated in a featureless chamber. No insignia marked rank. No banners hinted at authority. The setting was intentionally plain. When the human spoke, the voice was calm. "We acknowledge your request." The Council chamber fell silent. "We are aware of the Dominion. We have observed your losses. We understand the urgency of your situation." A pause followed, not dramatic, but deliberate. For generations, you chose when humanity was allowed to speak. When our concerns were worth addressing. When our survival mattered. There was no anger in the words. That era has ended. Council representatives responded quickly, invoking ancient defense accords and collective security principles. They spoke of precedent, obligation, and the greater good. They reminded humanity of everything it once sought to be part of. The human listened. Then answered with quiet certainty. "We will decide when to act." No threat followed. No conditions were offered. No reassurance was given. The transmission ended. In the cycles that followed, the Council waited, uneasy and exposed. Dominion forces continued their advance, systems falling faster as Council defenses fractured. Each loss reinforced an uncomfortable truth. Authority had already slipped beyond their reach. Then space itself began to tremble. Gravitational sensors across multiple sectors registered fluctuations that defied established models. Trade lanes warped. Navigation solutions contradicted themselves. Stars dimmed by fractional degrees, as though something vast had shifted its position between moments. Energy readings spiked in synchronized patterns, immense, controlled, unmistakably artificial. Human systems long believed dormant began to change. Structures unfolded from concealment fields, vast frameworks spanning thousands of kilometers. Fleets repositioned without visible acceleration, appearing where nothing had existed moments before. Defensive networks activated in layered cascades, locking into configurations no Council simulation could resolve. Humanity was not reacting. They were executing a decision made long ago. The Council finally understood what humanity had meant. Time was no longer something to be spent debating. It was something humanity now controlled. And when they chose to move, the universe itself would feel it. Human fleets emerged in perfect silence. There was no hyperspace flare, no gravitational wake, no warning detectable by Council sensors. One moment, the void between stars was empty. The next, it was filled with human vessels arranged in formations so exact that targeting systems struggled to render them as separate objects. Massive hulls locked into geometric precision, each ship positioned with absolute intent. No engines burned. No weapons charged. No shields flared to announce hostility. The fleets did not advance. They arrived. Dominion forces detected them seconds later. Command nodes erupted with alerts as targeting arrays came online. Weapon systems charged. Tactical AIs flooded with contradictory assessments as threat models collapsed under impossible data. Before the Dominion could coordinate a response, a message crossed every channel. Not transmitted. Not broadcast. Inserted. It bypassed encryption, ignored language barriers, and resolved itself into meaning within every sentient mind that received it. Stand down. There was no threat attached. No ultimatum. No explanation. The Dominion answered with fire. Planet-breaking beams carved through the void toward the human fleets. Missile salvos saturated predicted movement vectors. Kinetic barrages filled space with devastation. They struck nothing. Human ships were already elsewhere, repositioned without observable acceleration, as though distance itself had become irrelevant. Dominion fire passed harmlessly through empty space, targeting solutions obsolete before weapon cycles could complete. Then humanity responded. There was no barrage, no explosion, no spectacle. Entire Dominion formations lost power simultaneously. Engines shut down. Weapons went dark. Command links collapsed in perfect unison. Ships drifted, intact and helpless, crews alive but blind, deaf, and isolated. Where resistance persisted, space folded. Localized gravitational distortions crushed weapon systems inward, disabling them without breaching hulls. Dominion vessels found themselves trapped in regions where momentum no longer obeyed familiar laws. The engagement did not escalate. It concluded. Across multiple sectors, Dominion forces were neutralized in minutes. Not destroyed, not routed, not humiliated. Contained. Council observers watched in stunned silence as real-time feeds updated faster than comprehension allowed. Battles that should have taken years ended before emergency resolutions could be drafted. Dominion Command attempted retreat. There was nowhere to go. Human fleets anticipated every vector, every contingency, every desperate maneuver. Reinforcement signals vanished before they were fully formed. Escape routes collapsed into navigational impossibilities. The Dominion had prepared for war. Humanity had prepared for certainty. The final transmission came from a human command node, calm, precise, and absolute. Hostilities are concluded. The war ended before the enemy understood it had begun. And the galaxy finally understood what it meant when humanity returned from silence. The Council tried to reclaim control. Emergency sessions were convened in chambers that had not felt uncertainty in millennia. New resolutions were drafted. Authority was reaffirmed in careful language meant to sound decisive rather than desperate. Committees were formed to determine jurisdiction over liberated systems and to reassert the Council's role as the galaxy's guiding hand. It was too late. Human fleets did not withdraw when the fighting ended. They did not occupy worlds, claim territory, or demand tribute. They positioned themselves instead at critical junctions, along fractured borders, near destabilized regions, and beside worlds the Council had failed to defend. They did not issue commands. They remained. Council envoys approached with caution, their tone markedly changed. Requests replaced directives. Proposals replaced demands. Humanity responded politely, briefly, and without submission. There was no hostility in their words, but no deference either. The balance had shifted, irrevocably. Liberated species waited for conditions that never came. No oaths were required. No alliances enforced. Human ships repaired orbital infrastructure, restored communications, and departed without ceremony. Aid was given without expectation. Protection was demonstrated without promise. Some species offered loyalty. Humanity declined. Others asked for guarantees. Humanity gave none. Instead, they demonstrated something far more unsettling than rule. Consistency. Human patrols became a quiet constant in regions once abandoned to chaos. Trade routes stabilized, not through Council policy or enforcement, but through certainty. Piracy vanished. Expansionist powers reconsidered long-planned ambitions. Conflicts cooled before they could ignite. The galaxy adjusted its behavior, not because humanity ordered it to, but because it had witnessed what happened when humanity chose to act. The Council issued statements celebrating unity and cooperation, carefully framing the war's end as a triumph of galactic governance. Humanity did not challenge the narrative. They did not need credit. Across human space, fleets remained on alert. Engines stayed warm. Sensors remained active. There were no celebrations, no monuments, no declarations of victory. Humanity did not mark the end of the war. They prepared for what followed. Because humanity had learned what the galaxy was only beginning to understand. Darkness does not arrive with warnings. It does not announce itself or ask permission. It creeps. It adapts. It feeds on complacency and delay. Humanity had once been silenced. They would never be unready again. Humanity did not rule the galaxy. They did not seek thrones, councils, or empires built on arrogance and time-worn authority. They had simply proven a truth the stars themselves now seemed to remember. If darkness rises again, humanity will be there.